Hello viewers, welcome to week 1, lecture 2 of Swayam course on 20th century literary criticism and theory part 1. I am Ashish Kumar Pathak, assistant professor, Department of English, Banaras Hindu University, and we are going to continue the discussion of literary criticism and theory in this lecture. In the previous lecture, I have already talked about the origins of literary criticism and the parallels and distinctions between criticism and theory, how these words are understood in different contexts. So I will continue the same, and in this lecture the focus will be on to elaborate literary theory and various approaches to literature which go under the name of literary theory as we find in the 20th century. So when we move from the 19th century to the 20th century, we find some very visible changes taking place in the area of literary criticism. The first thing is that we find that literary criticism becomes international in its scope. What I want to say that, when you read these movements of criticism, these theoretical trends, you will realize that these movements are not centered to any one country, but the entire continent or more than one continent. They are involved in creation of theories, in developing this field of literary criticism. In fact, it all began, we can see, with Matthew Arnold, right? That when he was talking about the function of criticism, there Matthew Arnold says that the function of criticism is to learn and propagate the best that is thought and known in the world. And later on he adds that the best that is thought and known in the world cannot be of English origin only, right? So it has to be included from other countries as well. In a way, he started this tradition. When you come to the 20th century, we find that how it becomes, international in its scope. The other tendency that we notice that how literary criticism becomes interdisciplinary in the 20th century. For example, with the rise of other disciplines, advancement in those disciplines, we will feel that how sometimes anthropology, sometimes political science, sometimes sociology, all these disciplines or developments in linguistics and other areas, they are going to influence literary theory. So we find that in the 20th century, literary criticism becomes international in its scope as well as interdisciplinary in nature. Therefore, we find that literary criticism offers a bewildering variety of theory. See, new researches in the field of psychology, sociology, anthropology, political science, linguistics have brought about a revolution based on hybridity. Now, when we talk about the nature of literary criticism, so let us, talk about certain opinions expressed by individual critics, and then we will be able to understand that in what way literary criticism and theory, they are similar. So, for example, Eliot in his essay, The Function of Criticism in 1923 says that the function of criticism, he says that criticism should always profess a clear end in view, and he says that that is supposedly elucidation of works of art and the correction of tastes. Later on in 1956, Eliot writes his essay Frontiers of Criticism, and there he says that the function of literary criticism is to promote the understanding and enjoyment of literature. So, right, we find that there is a kind of development in his critical taste as well, and he thinks that understanding and enjoyment of literature is also important. In fact, it is not a new thing. If we go back to the origins of literary criticism, for example, when we talk about Horace, so Horace says that twin function of literary criticism is to educate as well as entertain, right? So edutainment that he had, professed as the function of criticism, somehow Eliot is also reiterating those things. When we come to F.R. Lewis is of the view that the analysis and judgment of works of literary art, that should be the function of criticism. And then we have also talked about the dimension of interpretation, that how, interpretation becomes very crucial to literary criticism. And this interpretation as an act of criticism, it depends on the competency of the individual critic as well as the methods adopted for the purpose, right? So, interpretation may vary. No fixed, interpretation can be considered to be a correct one. So, this variety is something that is represented in the 20th century, with the flourishing of many dimensions which correspond with literature, and in a way literary criticism or theory is influenced by those disciplines. Let us come to, the view of Jonathan Culler, where he says that what is literary theory? He says that literary theory is the systematic study of the nature of literature and of the methods for literary analysis. So, as we all know that the nature of literature and the function of literature, these two debates have always, revolved around this discipline of literary criticism, right? If we see the beginnings of literary criticism in Platonic discourses, there we find that how Plato is thoroughly, focusing on the nature of literature. He says what is literature and what it does, what function does it perform. So, in a way we find that, theory and criticism, somehow their concerns are similar, whether it was Plato or Jonathan Culler in the 20th century. However, the natures are different. The natures of discourses are different to some extent. We also notice that in the 20th century, literary theory, the practice of literary theory became a profession. It has been in existence, since the classical times. For example, in ancient Greece, we refer to Aristotle's Poetics, or in India, we refer to Bharat Muni's Natya Shastra, or, that Roman text on the sublime by Longinus. However, we feel that, it takes a sort of aura of profession in the 20th century, right? So, we can say that literary theory is a set of tools we use to analyze and find deeper meaning in the text we read. So, we find that the occupation of literary theory is still, analysis, judgment, elucidation, interpretation, and all these tools are helping us in decoding the meaning of the text, right? And, Jonathan Culler says that each different theory sheds light on a specific aspect of literature and written stories, which in turn provides us with a focus for interpretation of them. So, Jonathan Culler goes on to talk about salient features of literary theory. Let us take up those points. So, the first thing that he says that theory is interdisciplinary, discourse with effects outside an original discipline. I think I have already touched upon the point of interdisciplinarity, that how, new developments in different areas in social sciences and natural sciences, right? They are going to influence the appreciation of literature, and therefore literary criticism and theory. The second point that Jonathan Culler makes is that theory is analytical and speculative. He goes on to say that it is an attempt to work out what is involved in what we call sex or language or writing or meaning or the subject, right? So these methods are very important in exploration of all these areas. He further goes on to say, defining the other feature of literary theory, that theory is a critique of common sense, of concepts taken as natural. So, when we talk about literary theory also comes into existence by raising some questions about certain ideas which have been taken for granted, right? So the rise of theory is also associated with this questioning attitude, where everything is being questioned, whether it is our view towards language, whether it is view towards reality, whether it is our view towards class distinction, whether it is our view towards gender equations, or towards philosophy of life, towards metaphysics. So you find that all these disciplines are being questioned. The very basic understanding of all these concepts like class, gender, metaphysics, language, reality, all these things are being questioned, and somehow the rise of theory in the 20th century may be associated with that severe questioning. He goes on to say that theory is reflexive, it is thinking about thinking, it is an inquiry into the categories we use in making sense of things in literature and in other discursive practices. Right, so I think I have also hinted about that thing, that how literary criticism is about analysis of literature from various viewpoints, and literary theory takes into consideration those viewpoints, and in a way another discipline, another field emerges, that about the methods, the approaches we have towards literature or text, right? So having said these things in general about literary criticism and theory, we are very obviously aware that criticism can be called theory, as we drew a parallel between how Plato looks into the nature and function of criticism, and in the 20th century how Jonathan Culler is also talking about inquiry into the nature and function of literature. So in the 20th century, now let us come to what are various approaches to literary criticism. So when we look at these approaches, they can broadly be categorized into 4 parts. In fact, I would like to reiterate here that this division is only for the sake of convenience of study. It is not necessary that these are watertight divisions. So, the first kind of approaches that we can talk about, text-based approaches. So, approaches are text-based, author-based, reader-based, and context-based. These are 4 broad divisions. In text-based approaches, we have philology, rhetoric, formalism and structuralism, new criticism, semiotics, and deconstruction. I will introduce all these, areas to the readers. We have author-based approaches such as biographical criticism, psychoanalytic criticism, phenomenology. We have reader-based approaches which include reception theory, reception history, and reader response criticism. And we have context-based approaches, literary history, Marxist literary theory, feminist literary theory, new historicism, and cultural studies, right? So far as this course is concerned, I have already mentioned you that in this course, on this 20th century literary criticism and theory part 1, I am going to focus on text-based approaches and reader-based approaches, right? So I will be focusing on the formalistic approaches to literature. The context-based literature and author-based literature, they may be taken up in other courses that we develop in the long run. So let us first talk about text-oriented approach. So text-oriented approaches are concerned with the materiality of texts, including editions, manuscripts, analysis of language and style, and the formal structure of literary works. So these text-oriented approaches place a central emphasis on the internal textual aspects of a literary work. For example, philology, right? So philology, it was a discipline or we can say it is a branch of study which, talks about the language of a given text. It is a study of language, right? So philology denotes approaches focusing on editorial problems and reconstruction of text. As we know that during the heyday of the Renaissance, the ancient texts were discovered. With the invention of the printing press, there was proliferation of these texts. So, there was always a concern about which is the correct edition, which is the original edition of Shakespeare's King Lear, or which is the original edition of Homer's the Iliad or the Odyssey. So all such things. So during that time it was very popular, and with the passage of time we'll find that this has been evolving with the advancement of science and other approaches, empirical methodologies as they are implemented to the area of literature. And particularly in the current times, we find that philology has again assumed a very important dimension, because now, with the rise of computer assisted technology and digitization, philology has assumed a new dimension. Today we find that how all texts are being digitized. So in form of CD or e-books, the works of writers are available at multiple platforms. So even at this time, philology has been, revitalized in that way. The other area is rhetoric and stylistics. Rhetoric has been a very important part of literature. We know that we cannot imagine literature without rhetorical devices. In a way, we can say that what we do, for a longer time, it was believed in literary criticism, right from the time of Aristotle or Plato till the late 19th century. Literary criticism was somehow revolving around the understanding of literature as a form of rhetorical practice. Literature was considered to be an art of persuasion. It was a discipline with abundance of what is called figurative language, the use of figurative language. So we can say since the times of Greco-Roman culture, rhetoric encompasses a number of rules and techniques for efficient composition and powerful oratory. So in its attempt to qualify, classify systematically and investigate elements of human speech, rhetoric laid the foundation for current linguistics and literary criticism. If we go about Aristotelian concept of rhetoric and various dimensions, so rhetoric offers guidelines for every stage of textual composition, including inventio, that is selection of themes, disposio, that is organization of material, allocutio, verbalization with the help of rhetorical figures, memoria, technique of remembering the speech, and actio, it is delivery of the speech. So, Aristotle has mentioned these 5 components of rhetoric or the use of rhetoric in language. I think the same, may be seen in the field of literature as well. In the 19th century, rhetoric eventually lost its influence and partially developed into stylistics, a field that investigates the stylistic idiosyncrasies of individual authors and writers. So, that is how we come to know about rhetoric. The third is formalism and structuralism. In fact, in this course, we will be focusing on formalism of different kinds. For example, we'll be talking about Russian formalism. Russian formalism as a movement evolved in the first decade of the 20th century, right? And we will be talking about all the important Russian formalist critics like Victor Shklovsky, Roman Jakobson, Boris Eichenbaum, right? So, Jan Mukarovsky. We will be talking about all those critics and in what way Russian formalists for the first time offered separate tools, separate critical tools to analyze poetry as well as fiction. So, we will be taking up all those things in detail. Then we will be talking about new criticism. New criticism, as we all know, that is a movement which emerged under the leadership of T.S. Eliot and I.A. Richards, though later on you will find that Richards and Eliot, they dissociated themselves from that school. Eliot clearly says that I dissociate myself from that lemon squeezing school. That is what he calls new criticism or new criticism. But we find that how new criticism, evolved very much under the critical speculations of Eliot and Richards. And, all the new critics we will be talking about in detail. For example, J.C. Ransom, whose book gives this movement its name. We will be talking about Ellen Tate, we will be talking about R.P. Blackmer, we will be talking about Ransom, right? And we will be talking in detail about various critical concepts. For example, Clint Brooks uses the concept of paradox. R.P. Warren uses the concept of irony. William Ibsen uses the concept of ambiguity. Ransom uses the concept of texture. Blackmer uses the concept of gesture. So, all these new critics have their favorite terms, and in terms of while elaborating these terms, they, evaluate and they affect literary criticism. We will also be talking about structuralism, how structuralism and all the acolytes of structuralism. We will be primarily talking about Ferdinand de Saussure, who is called the father of structuralism, and other, structuralist critics like Roman Jakobson, Roland Barthes, or even Vladimir Propp, Northrop Frye. They all can be discussed, in this, or Jared Janet, so all these critics may be discussed in this, in the ambit of this movement called structuralism. Then we will be in detail talking about deconstruction, a movement which emerged under the leadership of French philosopher Jacques Derrida in the early 70s, right? And we will be talking about his philosophy of deconstruction, how, this deconstruction does not believe in genre distinction. It does not believe in any, difference between what we call literature and other disciplines, right? So these things, how, its critique of metaphysics, Western metaphysics, we'll be talking about that. We'll be taking up all deconstructionists or the acolytes of Derrida like Paul Deman, Barbara Johnson, Geoffrey Hartman, Right. So we'll be talking about all these. We'll also be talking about semiotics, which is a movement which is about the study of science and all that. Right. Philology, rhetoric, we have already talked about. Now we come to author-oriented approaches. So we will find that, literary criticism before the 20th century, it was very much author-oriented. So biographical criticism was very much there. Right, and phenomenological criticism, how this process of conceiving the reality, in which we discuss about epistemology, ontology, all these dimensions are included, and psychoanalytic criticism. However, in this unit, I have excluded all these approaches, author-oriented approaches, which may be taken up in other course when we'll do about non-formalistic approaches to literature. Then we have reader-oriented approach, reader response theory. It is also known as reception theory. It is very important. It focuses on reader's perspective. It is in sharp opposition to author-based approaches, where author is considered to be a god, he is considered to be a creator of the text. Reader response theory argues that a text is not created by the author, rather it is created by a reader. And in this way, we will be taking up, in detail, the basic tenets of reader response theory. We will be talking about Wolfgang Iser, we will be talking about Stanley Fish, we will be talking about David Bleach, we will be talking about Norman Holland, right? So like how all these critics, they talk about reader response criticism, right, and approaches. Then we have context oriented approaches, right? So here we find that literature is being discussed in the larger context of other disciplines like history, sociology, politics, gender, nationality, etc., etc. So, for example, Marxist literary theory, and new historicism, cultural studies, gender theory. These are all non-formalistic interdisciplinary approaches, and I have left it out for the other course because this course focuses on formalistic approaches to literature. So viewers, now we are done with the introduction to the course. I have been able to introduce you to this entire map of 20th century literary criticism and theory, and I have made it specifically clear that which approaches I am going to choose, which we are going to talk about in detail in this course. So thank you for viewing these lectures, and I think that it is going to be an enlightening and entertaining journey for all of us. Thank you.